Okay. Good Sunday morning to all of you who are watching on our premiere edition at 9:30 on Sunday, August 22nd. And for those of you who are watching later on the Stevens Valley Church YouTube site, thank you for joining us and for your interest in this subject. Today, we're going to be coming to the last of our examinations of particular denominations and movements. We've progressed in the study from the very beginning of the church up to today. Next week, we'll start a study of a brief summation of the main ideas that have come out of Christianity in 2,000 years. And then we're going to look at the way those ideas have affected, been incorporated into various denominations that exist today. So that's what lies ahead of us. But for today, we're going to look at the Presbyterian Church, Presbyterianism. So I do hope, as always, that what you're about to hear and see is accurate, that you are blessed, and that God receives the glory. With that in mind, let's take a look now as we find our roots in Presbyterianism, the story of Presbyterianism. I say at the outset, it is abbreviated because there is so much in regard to detail. Of course, we get bogged down, I think, in all the detail. It's going to be an overview. And it's important to understand that Presbyterianism definitely has its roots in the Reformation. As a matter of fact, I would think it would be perhaps the best representation of Reformation theology, Reformation thinking, and I'll explain in a moment. Now, reformers, talking about Protestant reformers, let's look at the first generation. This is a review. We've talked about all of these scholars in the past, but the first generation reformers are the leading edge of the Reformation. Somebody said the leading edge is the bleeding edge. So yes, they endured a good deal of opposition. They are the ones who hammered out, labored through theology, studying the scriptures, examining, and they are to be credited because they are really the people who, with the help of God, of course, formulated what is known as Reformed theology, which in their view, and I think we would agree, was a summary, was a recovery of the doctrines of the early church. That was the goal. Now, the Reformation began with Martin Luther and his assistant Philip Melanchthon. It is Martin Luther who defined the doctrine of forensic justification, justification by faith alone. And of course, that's a tremendous accomplishment. Then almost simultaneously with Luther was Ulrich Zwingli in Zurich, who reaches the same conclusions essentially. Then he is followed by, very quickly after that, by Wolfgang Capito, who preached in Basel, Switzerland, in Mainz, and Strasbourg, and Martin Bucer, who preached in Strasbourg, and John Oecolampadius of Basel, and others. Now, usually Luther and his followers are characterized as the evangelical church at that time, whereas Zwingli and the others who followed his thinking are classed as Reformed scholars. So the Reformation and the evangelical church, which of course was, we find the Heidelberg Catechism, an attempt to bring those groups together. That's the first generation of reformers. Second generation, of course, they're going to benefit from the scholarship, from the efforts, from the labor of the first generation reformers. And you will see, for instance, Guillaume Farel in Geneva. He is followed by John Calvin. And when Calvin is there, we see Geneva accepting the Reformation. Calvin will, of course, preach. He will study. He will establish the academy, which is now the University of Geneva. And perhaps the greatest contribution that Calvin will make will be his summation, his systematized theology, the institutes of the Christian religion. Of course, people are going to come to Geneva to study under Calvin, including John Knox, who takes the Reformed gospel back to Edinburgh. Theodor Base is Calvin's successor in Geneva. Heinrich Bullinger is Zwingli's successor in Zurich. Then there is a scholar, John Comenius, in Prague, which is Bohemia, which is now the Czech Republic. And then Peter, we haven't mentioned this gentleman before, Peter Martyr Vermigli. He is really the contribution of Italy to the Reformation, comes from Italy. He will be preaching at Strasbourg, he will preach in England, he will preach in Zurich. And by the way, he will go with Martin Bucer to England in 1549. Now, Reformation theology, Reformed theology, and focusing here upon the efforts of Zwingli and Bucer and Calvin and the others, the Reformed theology will spread all over Europe. It does not necessarily become the official church in every country. It does in Holland and in Scotland. In Holland, it becomes the Dutch Reformed Church, the official church, and that particularly through the efforts of William of Orange. In Scotland, it becomes the official church. We're going to look at that more closely in a moment, the Kirk of Scotland. But in Germany, there are pockets, areas of Reformed theology, such as around Heidelberg and Brandenburg, and that they will operate in tandem with the Lutherans. And I mentioned before, the Heidelberg Catechism is an attempt to provide a statement that both groups would adhere to. Now, there's a sizable Reformed community in Hungary and also in Transylvania, which is now part of Romania, and in Bohemia, which today is the Czech Republic, and in Poland, John Nolasco, for instance, coming from Poland, and in France, a large settlement of and contingency of Reformed people known as Huguenots, and that they were dispersed and destroyed and annihilated as a result of Catherine de' Medici's persecution that began on St. Bartholomew's Day in 1572 and were continued under the Jesuits. And then, of course, in England, and that becomes a very interesting place for a number of religious movements. So let's look more closely at the English Reformation. There were two times that a Reformed community was established. And by Reformed community, I mean that many of these reformers had in mind, had in view, a community that would live, the people would live in a Reformed context. That is, the Reformed Church would be the official church, and their lives would be structured by Scripture and the precepts of God as taught by the pastors. And we call these people the magisterial reformers who led that movement. And England had two experiments with a Reformed community. The first was King Edward VI, who was the son of Henry VIII. He came to the throne on the death of his father. Thomas Cranmer, at the time of his death, was the Archbishop of Canterbury. And Thomas Cranmer continued the Reformation. He had tried under Henry and was curtailed by Henry. So he is now free to operate. He puts together the 42 Articles, which become the creed of the church at that time. Unfortunately, Edward, as it's just a boy and he's not healthy, he died in 1553 and was succeeded by his half-sister Mary, who was known as Bloody Mary. And as a result, that ended the experiment with a Reformed community for a while, for about a century. And then later, the Puritans under Oliver Cromwell gained control of the Parliament and brought about a Reformed community for 20 years. You see the dates. In 1640 to 1660, that was the Commonwealth. But it was during that time that the Westminster Assembly met in Westminster Palace, Westminster Hall, and they assembled the Westminster Standards, Westminster Confession of Faith, the longer and shorter catechism, and the Directory of Public Worship. That ended in 1660 when Richard Cromwell, Oliver's son, was incompetent, and the people decided they'd rather have the king back. So they bring back King Charles II. So that's the end of that experiment. However, we see that Puritans continue in England, and the movement is not silenced by any means. The Congregationalists are Puritans who saw that there had to be a complete separation from the Church of England. They're the ones who came to America on the Mayflower in 1620. That was actually during the time of the Westminster Assembly and the Commonwealth. The Baptists are also in England. A good part of them are Reformed. There are a group of Baptists, however, who are not Reformed, Arminian Baptists, but particular Baptists are among the Reformed group. And then there were the dissenters. Dissenters were people who, pastors who remained in the Church of England after the end of the Commonwealth, but did not agree with the doctrines, but they still remained within it. Many times they lost their pulpits, but they make a great contribution to the Reformation. And in Scotland, Presbyterian church government was finally ensured by the Acts of Union of 1707, and we're going to turn our attention to that in a moment. But first, we've talked about this before. Should you be in Geneva, you can go to the Reformation Wall, which is a part of the old city wall, and it's very close to the University of Geneva, which is Calvin's academy there. And you see on the Reformation Wall the four leaders in Geneva: Farel, the first reformer; Calvin, second; Theodore Bayes, who succeeded Calvin; and John Knox, who went to Scotland. So let's focus on the Scottish roots. Presbyterians are particularly the result of the Scottish Reformation. I will say before we proceed that today Reformed scholars do look to the Dutch scholars as well, because they certainly contributed greatly to the scholarship of the Reformation. But primarily Presbyterianism began in Scotland. But there are some earlier roots. I found this interesting from some of the sources I looked at in preparation for this class. And one particularly commented on an earlier situation with the Celtic Christians. We've talked about Celtic Christianity. For instance, St. Columba, who took the gospel to Scotland early, that's called the Hiberno-Scottish mission, meaning Irish Scottish. And the makeup of Celtic Christianity is to have monasteries rather than so many local churches. It's all centered around the monastery. Now, when I gave you the study before, we called them abbots, who were the head of the monasteries. I found in this particular source, they were referred to as presbyters. And that being the case, that would tie in with the Presbyterian Church. So there was one person who exercised authority within the institution, while the different monastic institutions were independent of one another. You see the parallel to the later Presbyterian Church. Now, Celtic Christians from the beginning, and they were actually older than the Roman Catholic Church as an organization, they had different traditions. For instance, their monks shaved their heads and their tonsure differently from the Catholic monks, and the date of Easter was different. But in 664, the Synod of Whitby bound Roman customs on the Celtic. In other words, they decided that the Roman Church should be the official church, and that put an end to the Celtic Church as such. But the source commented, Celtic traditions remain, and I quote, the singing of metrical psalms, many of them set to old Celtic Christianity, Scottish traditional and folk tunes, which later became a distinctive part of Scottish Presbyterian worship. So that is interesting. But now let's come to John Knox, born in 1514, died in 1572, Scottish minister, theologian, and writer, who was a leader of the country's Reformation, and he was the founder of the Presbyterian Church in Scotland. He is so regarded. He preached at St. Giles Church in Edinburgh, and also he is noted among historians as having produced an excellent history of the Reformation in Scotland. Now, he spent a good deal of time in Geneva. He was exiled from Scotland, particularly during the time of Mary, Queen of Scots. She was a Catholic. and from the Guise family, or very strong Catholics. He had also spent some time as a slave on a slave ship, so he had quite an interesting youth. But while he was exiled from Scotland, he went to Geneva, and John Calvin allowed him to preach in a church. This is today called the Auditoire, and there every morning at 6 o'clock he preached to English-speaking Christians, and he continued to study with Calvin. When he returned to Geneva in 1559, and he preached at St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh. Now, I mentioned he studied under Calvin. I mentioned he had a lengthy conflict with Mary. He met with her 4 times, and they did not agree, let's say. They couldn't reach a compromise. There was a situation called the Siege of Leith in 1560. That's a year after Knox came back. That was the time that Mary, who had been married to the King of France, had arranged for French soldiers to be in Scotland to protect her claim to the throne of Scotland. There was a traditional relationship, treaty between France and Scotland. But at this time, the English are there, the French are there, they're squaring off against each other. And there was a siege upon the city of Leith. As a result, I'll just come to the result, as a result, the French backed off, they returned to France, and the English also backed off. And this allowed Scotland to be independent of the influence of both England and France. There was a Scottish Parliament in 1560, and by the legislation of the Scottish Parliament, they established the Scots Confession. It was written in 4 days by John Knox and adopted by the Scottish Parliament as the official creed for Scotland. The successor of Knox was Andrew Melville, and he will further organize the Scottish Church along Presbyterian lines to become the National Kirk, or National Church of Scotland. Playing a large role in these affairs were the Covenanters. They were committed to maintain this Reformed Kirk, organized under elders as the sole form of religion in Scotland. So they formed a godly bond or covenant, the first of which was signed by the Protestant lords of the congregation in December 1557. Please note that is 2 years before John Knox returned. They're the ones who were leading the Protestant movement in Scotland. They are the ones who managed to secure a situation where the French and the English both would back away. Now, at this time, at least 1603, Queen Elizabeth was the Queen of England. She died in 1603, and according to the settlement of Henry VIII, her father, the crown would go to the Stuarts. Now, of course, Mary was Queen of Scots, was indeed a Stuart, and James is her son. James was brought up as a Protestant, and it was assumed by the Scottish Kirk that James would be favorable to their idea of polity, which is organizing the church under elders. However, he surprised them. He refused to allow the Scots to organize the Kirk under presbyters, insisting on bishops. Now, the reasoning is very clear. He put it this way: no bishops, no king. In other words, I am the king, and I say there'll be no bishops. The reason is, as king, he could control the church much more easily under a bishop who has authority over a large number of churches, if not all of them. He has much more difficulty controlling churches under elders in each church. So the alternative view was best expressed by Andrew Melville, Knox's successor, as, and I won't try to read this with a Scottish dialect, there are 2 kings and 2 kingdoms in Scotland. Obviously a reference to King James's kingdom and to Christ's kingdom. And he proceeds, Christ Jesus the King, and this kingdom the Kirk. whose subject King James VI is. It was King James VI in Scotland, King James I in England. Yes, he's King James of the King James Bible. So King James moved the Church of Scotland towards an episcopal form of government, and he died, James, in 1625. He was succeeded by Charles I, and Charles appointed William Laud as Archbishop of Canterbury. And in 1637, there was the attempt to force the Church of Scotland to use the Book of Common Prayer, the Church of England's book of liturgy. And they resisted, of course. And the result was an armed insurrection with many Scots signing the Solemn League and Covenant. So these Covenanters are continuing now what they started earlier. These Covenanters would serve as the government of Scotland for nearly a decade and would also send military support to the Presbyterians during this English Civil War. And of course, Charles, this Charles that's mentioned here, successor of James, would in fact be removed, in fact executed. He's removed in 1640, executed in 1649. And during that time that the Puritans are gaining control in England, they have support from the Covenanters in Scotland. Now, the movement to establish a commonwealth, a reformed community, comes to an end in 1660, when Oliver Cromwell's son Richard was incompetent and the English people wanted their king back. So they bring back the monarchy under Charles II, and he reinstates an episcopal form of government on the church. Understand that from 1640 to 1660, the English church, as a reformed church, was operating under elders. Now, after Charles, his brother comes to the throne, and his brother, James, is a Catholic. It is said that Charles became a Catholic on his deathbed, but James is a Catholic, and the English did not want that. The result is the Glorious Revolution of 1688 that removed James II. And at that time, the Church of Scotland was finally, unequivocally, recognized as a Presbyterian institution by the monarch due to Scottish Presbyterian support for the revolution. The Scottish Presbyterians supported the overthrow of James II. He was replaced with William and Mary of Orange. Both of these, husband and wife, both were Protestants. William of Orange, of course, a Reformed Protestant. And so the support was given by the Scottish Presbyterians to the Glorious Revolution. And thus, they were recognized officially as the Church of Scotland. And a few years later, time of Queen Anne, the Acts of Union, which brought about Great Britain, between Scotland and England, guaranteed the Church of Scotland's form of government. But the Stuarts were not finished. There would be a final Stuart resistance, a final attempt to put, in fact, a Catholic on the throne of England under Bonnie Prince Charlie. And you see him here. He is the grandson of James II. James II was dead at this time, but he was hoping to put his father on the throne. So this is Charles Edward Stuart, also known as the Young Pretender, and Bonnie Prince Charlie. He was the claimant and heir apparent to the throne of Great Britain in the 18th century. He led the Jacobites, supporters of a Catholic monarch, in a series of victories across Scotland and England in 1745 in an attempt to recapture the throne, though he is chiefly remembered for his very sound, complete, and quick defeat at Culloden Moor on April 16th, 1746. The bloody battle and subsequent repercussions against suspected Jacobites in Scotland permanently ended the Jacobite cause and the Stuart threat. Earlier, there was a split in Scotland. A group of ministers seceded from the Kirk of Scotland to form the Associate Presbytery. Why? Well, at issue was whether or not the local lords could appoint the pastors. That was a custom. These lairds would appoint the pastors in their area, but the Presbyterians in Scotland felt that was a matter of the government, the church controlling, the state rather controlling the church. So they seceded. And another group seceded in 1761 to form the Relief Church. Now this situation continued, that the local governments, the lairds, continued to try to control the church. And it finally resulted in the disruption of 1843, which was a major uprising, and it led to the formation of the Free Kirk of Scotland. And there were further splits that took place, and many of them over theological issues. And most Presbyterians, but not all, were in Scotland were reunited by 1929 in the union of the established Kirk of Scotland, Church of Scotland, and the United Free Church. Now, these splits and many, many more have caused Presbyterians to frequently refer to themselves as split peas. What about Presbyterians in America? Presbyterianism first officially arrived in colonial America in 1644 with the establishment of Christ's First Presbyterian Church in Hempstead, New York. And the church was organized by the Reverend Richard Denton and spread rapidly after that. Interesting that today, the territory within about a 50-mile radius of Charlotte, North Carolina, is historically the greatest concentration of Presbyterianism in the southern United States, while an almost identical geographic area around Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, contains probably the largest number of Presbyterians in the entire nation. And just as a point of interest, R.C. Sproul came from Pittsburgh, and his ministry began in the Ligonier Valley, which is just, I think, about 15 miles from Pittsburgh. So that was the origin of that ministry that has made such an influence today. Now, as far as the American Revolution is concerned, Presbyterians were present by the time of the American Revolution, and John Witherspoon, president of Princeton, and Princeton was established by Presbyterians, was a member of the Continental Congress and the only signer of the Declaration of Independence from the ministry, and was instrumental in calling a general synod to uphold and support resolutions of the Continental Congress. Now, obviously, Presbyterians supported the Americans in the American Revolution, and this enthusiastic support for the Revolution from Scots-Irish, especially of Ulster, to oppose the British was significant. And they picked up the same motto that James had used to try to suggest the idea that he could not tolerate elders, no bishop, no king. You're rejecting me as king if you don't have a bishop. Well, indeed, these Scotch-Irish in America take up the same motto, no bishop, no king, meaning we don't want either. Horace Walpole remarked that cousin America had run off with a Presbyterian parson. And during this time, Presbyterians moved quickly to strengthen their church. After a synod meeting at Philadelphia in 1788, at the same time as the Constitutional Convention was in session at the same city. So it's a simultaneous movement. The Presbyterians understand it is to their advantage for the British to leave. So they support the revolution and they organize. And membership increased in the period between 1790 and 1837 from 18,000 to 220,557. However, there was a split in 1810. A group of Presbyterians in Tennessee, in fact, in Dixon County, Tennessee, broke away over a dispute, two matters, the education of the clergy and the doctrine of election. They rebelled against the predestination doctrine of the Reformed faith, and they rebelled against the idea that the clergy should be well educated. They didn't see the need of it in Tennessee that time. And so they created their own denomination, which really becomes an Arminian denomination. There was also a division between old school and new school Presbyterians, or old light and new light. And the old school opposed the project of the plan of union cooperation between Presbyterians and Congregationalists. Although Congregationalists and Presbyterians are both Reformed, They had become two separate denominations. There were some differences emerging, but the idea of the plan of union was we can accomplish more working together in evangelism and converting people than being separate. Now, the new school is more progressive. They supported that. The old school did not. Now, these two groups, new school, old school, were separate from 1837 to 1870. They were reunited on the basis of the Westminster Confession in 1870 and joined in 1906 by a large majority of the Cumberland churches who decided to come back to the fold, and in 1920 by the Welsh Calvinistic Methodists. However, not all joined. The Reformed Presbyterian Church of North America was of the old school. They remained separate. They also continued to the practice of a cappella singing, no instrumental music. But there was rapid growth in education in the 19th century as they expanded westward, and everywhere Presbyterian preachers built schools, colleges, and churches. Seminaries such as Princeton, Auburn, Allegheny, Columbia, Lane, McCormick, Union in Virginia, and Union in New York City. In 1857, as the Civil War was approaching, the old school did not see slavery as a problem, but the new school did. And several Southern synods withdrew to form the United Synod of the Presbyterian Church. And in 1861, 47 Southern presbyteries formed the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States of America. In 1865, the United Synod and the Confederate churches merged into the Presbyterian Church in the United States. In the North, the United Presbyterian Church of North America was a merger of Associate Presbyterian Church and the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church in 1858. From the 1920s to 1950s, coming down into the 20th century, there was a struggle over theology between liberals and conservatives, and also over a possible merger with the Episcopalians. The Presbyterian Church in the USA merged with the United Presbyterian Church of North America in 1958. And some who did not unite into the United Presbyterian Church include the Associate Presbyterian Church of North America and the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church, which was of Covenanter origins. So today, the Presbyterian Church USA is the largest, has more than 1.7 million members and more than 10,000 congregations. The Presbyterian Church in America in 2020 had 383,338 members in 1,928 congregations. They broke away over theological issues. Third largest, the Evangelical Presbyterian Church, having 122,216 members in 637 congregations. Then the Associate and Reformed Presbyterian Church, 39,681 members in 296 congregations. I will just say as a side comment, they maintain Erskine Theological Seminary in Due West, South Carolina, and they have summer assembly grounds at Von Clarken in Flat Rock, North Carolina. That I say because for 15 years, I taught at school in Wichita, Kansas. Our headmaster owned the house there at Von Clarken. The reason he owned it is the fact that his wife's father was one of the leaders in the ARP church. And so oftentimes he would go there, and sometimes even faculty members could go there. Of course, there are many theological seminaries that are associated with the other Presbyterian groups. Then the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, 30,759 members in 270 congregations. This group founded by Gresham Machen. The Cumberland Presbyterian Church, I will list, also still not a part of the Presbyterian Church as such because of their beliefs, but they have 70,810 members in 709 congregations. Just a thought about American evangelicalism. I found this quote. I thought it was interesting. I just want to share it with you. This source said, evangelicalism itself is a North American phenomenon derived from the confluence of Pietism, Presbyterianism, and the vestiges of Puritanism. Well, 3 Ps. And then explained this way: evangelicalism picked up the peculiar characteristics from each strain, such as warm-hearted spirituality from the Pietists, doctrinal precisionism from the Presbyterians, and individualistic introspection from the Puritans. Now, that's kind of interesting. I'll just throw that out as a thought. That's one person's conclusion. Now, some distinctives of Presbyterians. Well, one thing one thinks of as a distinctive is the regulative principle of worship. That's the driving principle in the standards of worship. It specifies that in worship, what is not commanded is forbidden. We see that in the doctrine of Zwingli and Bucer and Calvin. Most Presbyterian churches follow the traditional liturgical year and observe the traditional holidays, holy seasons, such as Advent, Christmas, Ash Wednesday, Holy Week, Easter, and Pentecost. They also make use of the appropriate seasonal liturgical colors. Many incorporate ancient liturgical prayers and responses into the communion services and follow a daily, seasonal, and festival lectionary. Now, there are still some Presbyterians that practice a cappella singing, and some, that was the case in the ARP Church, certainly until recently, exclusive psalmody, that is, only the Psalms are sung, and as well as disallowing the celebration of holy days. Baptism, in which, and this is all Presbyterians, they would baptize infants as well as unbaptized adults by the aspersion, sprinkling, or effusion, pouring method in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, rather than the immersion method. Having said that, I will point out there are some Presbyterian churches, such as Christ Community in Nashville, which use immersion as a method of baptism. As far as the Lord's Supper is concerned, Presbyterians believe in the real presence of Christ in the spiritual sense in the bread and wine through the Holy Spirit. This is essentially the doctrine defined by Martin Bucer and then perpetuated by John Calvin. In worship, there may be a rail between the communion table and the chancel behind it, which may contain a more decorative altar-type table, choir loft, or choir stalls, lectern, and clergy area. The altar is called the communion table, and the altar area is called the chancel by Presbyterians. Some Presbyterian church buildings are often decorated with a cross that has a circle around the center, Celtic cross. A baptismal font will be located either at the entrance or near the chancel area. And Presbyterian architecture generally makes significant use of symbolism in stained glass and in other methods. I will say there is also a very careful attempt to avoid showing any actual depiction of the deity. Now, as far as polity is concerned, Presbyterian churches are organized at the local level under elders, and their meeting together is called a session. Then above that, the presbytery, above that, the synod, and above that, a general conference that meets once a year. In some places, the synod is omitted. In terms of education, Presbyterians have a definite reputation for promoting education, both among the clergy and laity. Thus, you see the establishment of seminaries and the establishment of colleges and universities, and a large number of books published by Presbyterian scholars. Let me pause to say that I know of a fact that teachers at colleges outside of the Presbyterian denomination do respect, do use the scholarship of these Presbyterian scholars and admit that nobody has better scholarship than Presbyterians do. And there are ministries such as Ligonier, designed to educate the public at large. R.C. Sproul's effort was to educate the public on the sovereignty of God above all things. And there's an emphasis on Sunday schools, an emphasis on foreign missions to teach the gospel, as well as the establishment of a number of hospitals. This is a chart which shows the Presbyterianism, the family connections it's called, And you see the lines there are the different Presbyterian churches, and where you see them coming together, that's a merger. And when you see they're going apart, like the arrow that indicates a break off, those are the splits. The Presbyterian churches of today are represented by the ones at the far right. It's an interesting study. I do not have the time to go over all of it with you. I'll be glad to send it to anyone who's interested. It's also available, of course, on the internet. Now, Presbyterians worldwide. In Scotland, there are now 8 Presbyterian denominations. In order of size, the Church of Scotland, the Free Church of Scotland, the United Free Church of Scotland, the Free Presbyterian Church of Scotland, the Free Church of Scotland Continuing, the Associate Presbyterian Church, the Reformed Presbyterian Church of Scotland, and the International Presbyterian Church. Combined, they have over 1,500 congregations in Scotland. In Ireland, Presbyterianism is represented by the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, the non-subscribing Presbyterian Church of Ireland, the Free Presbyterian Church of Ulster, the Reformed Presbyterian Church of Ireland, and the Evangelical Presbyterian Church. Presbyterianism, and you see the Irish word there, which I will not attempt to pronounce, is the largest Protestant denomination in Northern Ireland and the second largest on the island of Ireland after the Anglican Church of Ireland. The official Church of Ireland is the Anglican Church. In England, in 1972, the Presbyterian Church of England united with the Congregational Church in England and Wales to form the United Reformed Church. This is interesting. In Italy, the Waldensian Evangelical Church, Chiesa Evangelica Valdese, we've talked about the Waldensians before, that's the Italian Protestant denomination. That church was founded in the 12th century, and centuries later, after the Protestant Reformation, it adhered to Calvinist theology and became the Italian branch of the Presbyterian churches. As such, the church is a member of the World Communion of Reformed Churches. In Mexico, the biggest Presbyterian church is the National Presbyterian Church in Mexico, which has about 2,500,000 members and associates and 3,000 congregations. But there are other small denominations like the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church in Mexico, which was founded in 1875 by the Associate Reformed Church in North America. The Independent Presbyterian Church and the Presbyterian Reformed Church in Mexico, the National Conservative Presbyterian Church in Mexico are existing churches in the Reformed tradition. In Canada, the largest Presbyterian denomination, and indeed the largest Protestant denomination, was the Presbyterian Church in Canada, formed in 1875 with the merger of 4 regional groups. And in 1925, the United Church of Canada was formed by the majority of Presbyterians combining with the Methodist Church Canada and the Congregational Union of Canada. Now, a sizable minority of Canadian Presbyterians, primarily in Southern Ontario, but also throughout the entire nation, withdrew and reconstituted themselves as a non-concurring, continuing Presbyterian body. They regained use of the original name in 1939. In Brazil, the Presbyterian Church of Brazil totals approximately 1,011,300 members. Other Presbyterian churches, independents, united, conservatives, renovated, so forth, in this nation have around 350,000 members. There are probably more than 4 million members of Presbyterian churches in all of Latin America. In Korea, Presbyterian churches are the biggest and by far the most influential Protestant denominations in South Korea, with close to 20,000 churches affiliated with the 2 largest Presbyterian denominations in the country. In South Korea, there are 9 million Presbyterians, forming the majority of the 15 million Korean Protestants. In South Korea, there are 100 different Presbyterian denominations. In Taiwan, the Presbyterian Church in Taiwan is by far the largest Presbyterian denomination in Taiwan, with some 238, 372 members, as of 2009, including the majority of the island's Aborigines. In India, in the mainly Christian Indian state of Mizoram, Presbyterianism is the largest of all Christian denominations. The Presbyterian Church in India was integrated in 1970 into the United Church of Northern India, which was originally formed in 1924. It is the largest Presbyterian denomination in India. In Australia, Presbyterianism is the fourth largest denomination of Christianity, with nearly 600,000 Australians claiming to be Presbyterian in the 2006 Commonwealth Census. In New Zealand, Presbyterianism is the dominant denomination in Otago and Southland, due largely to the rich Scottish and to a lesser extent Ulster Scots heritage in the region. The area around Christchurch, Canterbury, is dominated philosophically by the Anglican denomination. So what about our own family tree at Stevens Valley Church? Well, we go back to 1981 in Nashville. The first Presbyterian church, which is PCUSA, divided over theological issues. A number of people left under Pastor Cortez Cooper and established the Christ Presbyterian Church, PCA. And then was established from that the Christ Community Church under Scotty Smith, and also Covenant Presbyterian Church under Jim Bachman, and Stevens Valley Church as an independent Reformed biblical church under Pastor Jim Bachman. So we've reached the end of the examination of these different groups. And as I said at the beginning of our class today, next week I want us to look at the ideas that have shaped Christianity. We've seen them in detail, examining these different time periods and different groups, but I wanted to put them together as kind of a chart of ideas, main ideas, and see how they have influenced various groups. So that will be our study for next week. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope it's been an interesting study for you. I do not claim that everything we said here today is the full extent of the story. There's much more to be told, but that at least gives us an idea of the development of the Presbyterian Church. So may you have a blessed week, and certainly hope that the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, and the love of God our Father, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit will remain with you all.